Um, so Mr. Mwila Bwanga is an optimistic and visionary leader that is passionate about building the leaders we need for the Africa we want. He nursing 8 years worth of experience in the leadership and governance development space across the continent. He is a social entrepreneur, an award-winning governance expert, award-winning author, international speaker, and executive director at BeRelevant Africa. Mwila holds a politics and international relations degree from the University of Lusaka. Mwila's leadership track record ranges from being the former president of the University of Lusaka Students' Union, serving as Zambia's national youth delegate at the Commonwealth Youth Council, and as a former Commissar Youth Representative for Zambia. Mwila has been listed as one of Zambia's best governance minds below the age of 35 and was awarded the Governance Accomplishment Award during the 2020 National Youth Awards by the government of the Republic of Zambia. Mwila was the youngest contesting member for the Changa constituency in Chingola and on the Copper Belt during Zambia's 2021 general elections and came out third in the race with 5 candidates. Mwila has built his leadership journey on the philosophy that the problems of our society are inevitable, but as a people, we have to be the inevitable solution to society's inevitable problems. And at the core of such solutions is the development of credible leadership across all sectors of human civilizations. So before we just bring up Mwila, I wanted to say that there is one trend that I noticed about 3 of our speakers, even though they spoke across 3 different ranges, is that the concept of entrepreneurship, whether a social entrepreneur, whether for-profit entrepreneur, they are entrepreneurs. So it kind of shows us that entrepreneurship is really, really important. I mean, I don't think I want to go into that now, but just know that entrepreneurship is this is saying a lot. This is like talking to us like in a very loud voice, right? Entrepreneurship. So thank you so much, guys. Let's welcome Mwila Bwanga all the way from Zambia. Guys, please share. Like you have to share this. Let people come and listen to them. Some people have exited already, but just share with your network and let people come and listen to it. This is our last speaker for today, but in no way at all the least, Mr. Mwila, thank you so much. Thank you so much. So you can come up.
Thank you so much. Let me just set up. I'll be just in a little bit. Just want to connect this gadget.
Okay.
Also, please remember that as the session is going on, if you have questions, do not wait till the end of the session. You can always send a chat as the session is going on. So sometimes you probably might just forget what the question is. So as the session is going on, please drop the question that you have in the chat box. Thank you.
Okay, Ish, thank you so much. I'm having some big challenges with my camera right now. I hope that it will go on later on. But in the meantime, allow me to just start speaking because of time. And thank you so much for giving me the opportunity to speak to you guys today. I'm super excited. I don't take it for granted. My name is Mwila Bwanga, all the way from a country in the southern tip of Africa called Zambia, the land of the Zambezi River, the land of the Victoria Falls, and many other natural resources that I do not want to delve into. When I got the invite to be part of this conversation, I was delighted because the topic that you are addressing at this moment in time is something that is so dear to my heart. But before I start speaking, one of the things that I take into account is to ensure that I speak within the framework of what the organizers want me to speak on. That I am very much certain on, but I'd like to also know my time frame. How many minutes have I been given to speak so that I don't go overboard?
Okay, you have 30 minutes.
Okay, great. Thank you so much.
And then we have 10 minutes for question and answer too.
All right, so we can do it 20 and then now we'll see how it goes. But thank you so much. Okay, so when we look at the whole topic at hand, which is basically trying to advance integrity in the governance spaces, many of us know that Africa's history does not begin at the point of colonialism. And that's where many of us have missed it, that we think that Africa's history in itself begins at a point when Africa got colonized. Many of us also think that Africa's history begins at a point when Africa achieved its independence. But what we also don't take time to talk about is what was Africa before colonization? What was Africa before slavery? And I'll tell you the truth that Africa's civilization and Africa's contribution to the whole entire spectrum of the global political space has been immense. And that's something that we have to consistently take into account, consistently document. And that's why it bothers me that we have so many people who hold PhDs across the African continent, but they've not taken the time to pen down Africa's history to such a point that future generations begin to appreciate that Africa was such a great deal of a continent before the colonization and before the slave trade came to be. When we look at how Egypt's civilization contributed greatly to the civilization of other civilizations, that is something that we honestly have taken into account. When we even talk about the subject of democracy, democracy did not come on the shores of the African continent in the early 1990s, but it was always in existence. One thing that you and I always come to understand, even when we look at it from our traditional sectors, from our traditional concept of governance, is that everything that happens and everything that goes on has the will of the people, regardless which angle you might want to look at it. So even the whole entire subject of democracy is not something that is new on the African continent. It is something that has always been there. It's just that we have looked at democracy from a different angle and from a different lens. And the biggest challenge we have had for so many years as a continent is that we have viewed democracy not from an eye of an African context, but we have viewed democracy from the Western lens. When it's good for America, it's good for us. When it's good for Europe, it's good for us. That is the lens that we have used every time that we're trying to microscopically navigate the whole entire subject of democracy and governance, as it were. But as we have this conversation, my dear colleagues, let us begin to disrupt some of these narratives that have always existed. That, in order for us to appreciate what we are doing politically is only when it has the stamp and approval of Western countries. And that is the biggest challenge that we have had in trying to advance integrity in African politics, because the biggest challenge that's been there is not that African leaders in themselves are corrupt. It's that African leaders are put in that particular context by certain powers that be, and to some degree they find themselves to uphold a brand that is corrupt, a brand that lacks integrity, a brand that lacks transparency, and so on and so forth. It started during the times of colonialism, which we had indirect rulership. I'm sure many of us have heard that when the colonial authorities came to be, what they did is that they selected certain African subjects who could then be used as surrogates for the colonial authorities in order for them to collect taxes from the African people. So these people were basically used as subjects for the colonial authorities. And these people were hated by fellow Africans. And what they could do is that they could basically benefit, at the expense of the actual African not benefiting in one way or another. But when I sit back and there's a reason why I'm giving you this genesis. Many people out there, they'll say, it's not necessary for us to talk about colonialism, we need to move on. It's not necessary for us to talk about slavery, we need to move on. But one thing we have to understand, my dear colleagues, is that if we do not appreciate where we are coming from, we cannot even fathom where we are going. It's important that we take time to appreciate where we are basically coming from, the landmarks that we have had, the impact we have had on history, our setbacks, our challenges, our misfortunes. We begin to appreciate that. The very moment we begin to take full stock of our history, it becomes easier for us to even plan for the future that lies ahead as an African, as the African continent. So when we come to this deep conversation of promoting integrity in Africa's governance spaces, my dear colleagues, and I'm sure that many of us know this, whether it's West Africa, North Africa, East Africa, Southern Africa, that politics has a hand in the development of every sector. For entrepreneurship to thrive, there has to be political stability. For business to thrive, there has to be political stability. For religious activity to thrive, there has to be political stability. Politics in one way or another, regardless how we may want to look at it, has a hand in almost every sector of development, almost every sector of national relevance, almost every sector of human civilization and human integrity. At the core of economic development is politics, my dear colleagues. At the core of civilization is politics. At the core of technological advancement is politics. We may have the most smart and smartest of young people in a particular country, but if the policies in place intend to choke entrepreneurship, intend to choke the very fabric of young people's creativity, it becomes impossible for such a group of smart, intelligent, and creative young people to thrive and bring about any meaningful development in that particular country. So as we begin, let us take into account that politics has a hand to play in almost every sector of our development. And by having established that foundation, it's important that the people who are now at the helm of politics are people of upright and absolute integrity. Because above and beyond, my dear colleagues, what we need more in Africa as we speak right now are not politicians that speak good English, not politicians that speak good French, not politicians that speak good Arabic, not politicians that speak good Swahili. What we need more now, more than ever before, are politicians who speak better patriotism, are politicians who speak unity, are politicians who speak peace, are politicians who are futuristic in their agenda, and are politicians that think of the people before they can think of themselves. Politicians that bring change to society before they can bring change to their pockets. Politicians that think of the future before they think of the next big thing. You know, there's this amazing story that has been told that a certain gentleman went to a certain civilized country and he was taken up, a particular mountain, and they stood there with this amazing leader of this civilized country. And this civilized leader pointed out and he said, have you seen, look at all these developments, the skyscrapers, education infrastructure, the health system, everything you see here, we've been able to do with 80% of our budget, and 20% is something that at least we use to benefit ourselves. But everything you see here has been funded by the people, by the people themselves. When this leader of this civilized country now came to a third world country, the same leader of the third world country did the very same thing, took him up the roof and showed him a vast land and told him that, are you able to see all this? And the civilized leader was surprised because he could only see trees, monkeys, and cockroaches. So he asked the question, I can't see anything here. So he said, 100% of the budget comes in my pocket. It goes nowhere. And sadly enough, that is the kind of political framework that we have. So when we talk about governance integrity, my dear colleagues, it's something that is very important. But the question we should be asking ourselves is, how can we bring about integrity in the governance spaces? And the answer I have for you today is that integrity in the political space, integrity in the governance spaces is depending on the African youth. We can't hope that it will come from the leaders we have now. We have so many great leaders on the African continent, but we should also be alive to the fact that we have so many useless leaders on the African continent. We have to say it as it is. The biggest problem that we have as a region is because we are not telling each other the truth. So we have to start telling each other the truth. We have so many useless leaders, comrades, and we have so many good leaders. But then the onus of taking this country forward is resting on Africa's youngest population, who is you and I. And the question we should be asking ourselves is, are we ready to take up the arms of leadership? And many of us as young people, we've been telling ourselves we want spaces, we want to be counted, and so on and so forth. But if we do not begin to disrupt certain things about ourselves and our lives, we are just going to be a new replacement of different corrupt leaders. The only thing that will be there is that we'll be younger but corrupt, and then there's an older generation that is older and corrupt. So we'll be the younger and corrupt generation, and there's an older and corrupt generation. But for us as young people, the first thing that we have to do is to rekindle our patriotism if we want to restore integrity in our governance spaces. So what do I mean? When the African people started organizing themselves in order for them to fight colonialism, my dear colleagues, they were organized. They did not think of competition. The biggest problem that is disrupting the youth movement across the African continent is the unhealthy competition we have amongst ourselves. Each and everyone wants to be a celebrity. Each and everyone wants to be seen and noticed. Each and everyone wants to be taken into account as the one that started this movement. And we have all these big titles, but nothing to show for it. Founder of this, executive director of that, and so on and so forth. But when you ask such a person, what is the tangible change that we can see that you have ignited? There's nothing to be noticed. But when we go back in the early 1950s, the people that organized themselves to advance Africa's independence, these people lived at a time when there was no social media, but they were still united. That people in Southern Africa knew what was happening in West Africa. That people in West Africa knew what was happening in East Africa. How they did this, I have no idea. But they were organized. And that's the point number one we also need to do, my dear colleagues. We need to organize ourselves as young people. We need to break these boundaries and barriers we have created for ourselves. There is no such thing as I am purely Nigerian, so I care less what is happening in Zambia. We should care more about what is happening in each other's countries, because beyond the nationalities we have one thing in common, and that is that we are all African. The moment I leave my country to go to another country, I will not be referred to as a Zambian, I will be referred to as an African. So that in itself should be something that should be paramount. That's why it breaks my heart when I see South Africans engaging themselves in xenophobic habits, because they forget that before South Africa achieved its independence in the early 1990s, the people of Africa were giving them refuge. The Nigerians were giving them refuge. The Zambians were giving them refuge. So let's not forget that history, my dear colleagues. Patriotism is important. If our forefathers, such as Kwame Nkrumah, Patrice Lumumba, Kenneth Kaunda, Simon Kapwepwe, and the list goes on, Nelson Mandela, Samora Machel, and all these other guys, if they were not organized and they never had the spirit of patriotism, we would still be colonized today. So my plea before us today, my dear colleagues, if we want to champion integrity, let us be patriotic. And the next point, let us love our continent, let us love the countries that we are coming from. Regardless the challenges our countries are having, let us see what we can do about it. Think about it. If our leaders by then, they told each other, you know what? I feel like this colonialism thing is not creating room for me to make business. Let me just leave the country but they still organized themselves and did what they could. So the challenges we are noticing in Nigeria, they are not for anyone else to solve but us. The challenges we are noticing in Botswana, in Zambia, in Egypt, in South Africa, in Libya, in Morocco, the challenges we are noticing are not for anyone else to solve but us. And that is why I say that at this moment in time, in the 21st century, The people that will be celebrated will not be people that had the greatest of titles. It will be people that solved the greatest of problems. Those will be the people that will be celebrated. The question I want to ask you and I, my dear colleagues, in which number will we be counted? Are we going to be counted as a generation of young people with powerful CVs and extraordinary bios? Are we going to be counted as a generation who solved some of the greatest problems that Africa has ever encountered? Our forefathers gave us political independence. The onus is now on us to achieve the economic freedom that the African people are crying for. No one else would do it but you and I. Any revolution you can think about, whether in China, whether in Cuba, whether in France, whether in South Africa, any great revolution you can ever think about, my dear colleagues, was ignited, influenced, and started by young people. And it does not mean that in order for you and I to champion the subject of integrity in the governance spaces, we need to be in politics. That is a perception we need to begin to disrupt. Not every human being has been called to politics. But the question you should be asking yourself is, in this space I am currently in as a young entrepreneur, what change am I bringing to my community? As a health practitioner, what change am I bringing to my community? As a religious person, what change am I bringing to my community? As a human rights activist, what change am I bringing to my community, my dear colleagues? The other point I also want to stress as I begin to wrap and begin to just give us an opportunity to now have a conversation. The last point I want to add is this, and I think it's very cardinal and it's very important. Exposure does not mean you limit your agenda to the African continent. Many of us, when we get exposed, I've traveled and I've traveled a lot. I've been to almost every European country. I've been to the US. I've been in almost every, but one thing I'll tell you the truth, my dear colleagues, my passion and my love for my content has never been diluted. The biggest challenge that is confronting many of us as young people is that we are mistaking exposure to now diluting our love for Africa. When you go out to Europe to study and you come back to Nigeria or Zimbabwe, don't bring a mini Europe and you think that's the only way you can develop your continent, your country, or your continent. Exposure shows you what can be done. When you come back to your country, begin to ask yourself, what can I do differently? If many of us have traveled to Dubai, Dubai is in a league of its own. They do not imitate anyone. They are in their own league. And same thing applies to each and every African youth from Cairo to Cape, from Cape to Cairo. When we get exposed and we come back to our individual countries, let us now not begin to look down on the African continent. Africa has made us who we are. Even when we go beyond the borders of Africa, let people begin to see that Africans are smart, that Africans have what it takes, that Africans have integrity. But more importantly, let us be united beyond borders, my dear colleagues. As I wrap up my topic, let me awaken you at this moment in time. The people that gave us the Africa we have today were all between the ages of 15 and 30 years old. If you are a 25 young person listening to me right now, start asking yourself, at the time you clock 40, how will the world remember you? At the time you clock 50, how will the world remember you? When the time comes to be with your maker, how will the world remember you? We have celebrated Nelson Mandela for too long. We have celebrated Kwame Nkrumah for too long. We have celebrated Samora Machel for too long. We have celebrated Thomas Sankara for too long. We have celebrated Patrice Lumumba for too long. We need to start celebrating a new generation of heroes. And I hope you and I will be in that number. Thank you so much for giving me this opportunity to speak to you. Shukran, asanteni sana, merci beaucoup. Thank you very much.
Wow, thank you so, so much. Dakwa, are you there? Okay, please go on.
Yes, I'm here. Thank you so much, Mr. Mwila Bwanga. That was really insightful. We appreciate you. Thanks so much for your time, and thank you so much for skipping the time. By the way, in fact, I feel like when you explained to him that he had 30 minutes to speak, Lewa, when you explained to him that he had 30 minutes to speak and 10 minutes for the question, I think he assumed he had 20 minutes to speak. So, but all the same,
Oh, okay. It was
yeah,
30, but I mean, it's okay. We will use the rest for the question and
exactly.
answers.
So, yes, anybody with questions, please, you can drop your questions in the chat box, and at the same time, you can also indicate your hand. But already, I think okay, we don't have a question yet in the chat box. Please, if you have a question, kindly indicate that you have a question, and we'll just allow you to, or we'll take the questions now before we.
Okay. Okay, so while you're at it, I think please drop your questions if you have questions.